So today we have a special treat. I'm joined here with Professor Zack Moir. He has come here to talk to us about Frary and his views and tie this together with music education. Zack, could you go ahead and introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, thank you very much. As you say, my name's Zack Moir, and I am a Professor of Learning and Teaching at Edinburgh Napier University, which is in Edinburgh in Scotland.
So immediately, I think it's quite obvious to address the elephant in the room that I'm all the way in Florida and you're over in Scotland, and music education and music practices looks quite different here probably for us, and even based off of our experiences. In the United States, a lot of it is really centered around what we call like the big three: the choir, band, and orchestra. Personally, I grew up as a trombone player. I started playing trombone in middle school, continued through high school, and then got my music education degrees, and I taught high school for a little bit before returning for my PhD. So I'm really versed in kind of that band world sense of things, which is really different from other disciplines within music education here, but also around the world. Could you share with us a little bit about what music practices and education look like in your perspective?
Yeah, sure. And it's really interesting to hear you say that, and a lot of the work that I've done over the last 10 years or so has been with colleagues that are in America, and actually just coming to learn how very, very different our systems are has been a real eye-opening for me, because you naively just assume that your system is the one that's somewhat universal around the world, and it kind of makes sense, but actually the experience is so different. To just give a kind of brief example of some of those differences, I suppose whilst you're talking about you've got these three kind of main paradigms, and with that comes cultures and traditions and hierarchies and all the other things that we associate with those type of kind of musicking forms, if you like. We've got a very different approach over here, I think. Now, I say over here, and I guess over here I'm talking about Scotland, because that's the country that I'm in, but that's within the United Kingdom, and actually even within the United Kingdom, which includes England, Wales and Northern Ireland, the systems differ greatly. So if ever I say we or us, I'm really talking about the Scottish education system, which is the one that I'm most familiar with. Really, we've got a kind of broad general approach to music education, which kind of sits within the curriculum as a kind of art strand, as a sort of cultural strand, and you might get that alongside visual art, you might get that alongside dance, like country dancing and that kind of thing. That would all be part of a kind of broad approach to having arts within the curriculum. So certainly at primary school, I guess maybe equates to what you guys call elementary school, I suppose. So we're talking the ages 5 to 11 or 12, roughly speaking. It's something that happens in class singing situations, in maybe class percussion circles, that type of thing. There might be a choir in the school, but it's not the kind of archetypal paradigm for music making. It's an extracurricular thing that people can go and do if they want to do more of that.
Okay.
As we get into high school, so then we're maybe talking the ages of 12 to 18, we tend to get this opportunity for some kids to specialise more. So some of these young people are getting the opportunity to take up instrumental lessons. Some of these kids young people are getting the opportunity to play in the band, to play in choir, to play in the jazz band, to play in the rock ensemble, to play in various things that are available. But often that's where it becomes a bit more specialised, and as a result, I regret to say, probably a bit more exclusive. Now, I don't think that's deliberate in that they're trying to exclude anyone, but finances are what they are. Finances are finite, and as a result, not everyone can engage with it. But certainly in the first 2 years of high school, it's a mandatory subject that all students take. They learn about music, they learn about it in a really general sense, they learn about composition, they learn about performance, they learn about kind of listening and appreciation, music theory to a degree. And then if they choose to specialise thereafter, they're given the opportunity to do so. So even within the school system, there's a choir, and there's a jazz band, and there's a orchestra potentially, depending on the resources in the school. But these are just outlets for people to engage, rather than the kind of candle that everyone's drawn to, if you see what I mean.
Gotcha. I've been making my way through the book Community Music by Lee Higgins recently, and it's been eye-opening for me because it's largely informed by a view that's over in Europe and a lot of community music over there. And he does talk about America as well, but he's over there in England, I believe it is. And he talked about a lot of the community music ensembles that exist. And what I found interesting is there's community organizations where some students learn like band and choir and orchestra kind of, and there's this intergenerational aspect. Would you say that stuff is kind of common, or is that still kind of unique throughout over there?
It's not uncommon, but it's certainly not the kind of norm for music education engagement. Now, there is that whole debate about community education and music education, and is it education or is it community activity, and that's an important debate, but one that we've probably not got time necessarily to get into here.
Yeah,
but
that's another thing.
If we see that as part of, exactly, if we see that though as part of the general scope of things that are available to people throughout their lifespan, then yeah, absolutely, we're fortunate in the sense that there are still some community endeavours around. However, in the neoliberal world that we live in which public services and public finances are getting reduced, almost to the extent that they don't exist anymore, sometimes that comes down to just the goodwill of individuals or the goodwill of venues or music libraries or instrumental libraries, for instance. So actually we're seeing a lot of that thing disappear just as a result of the economic conditions that we find ourselves in, which is sad. But I suppose the thing is that there are a lot of people that are taking these things on, and a lot of opportunity still exists. I think the issue with that, though, is that sometimes the opportunity exists in a way that normalises certain approaches to music making, and we can then probably see the rise of choirs or community bands and this kind of thing maybe taking centre stage because of the fact that they're the things that are most obviously recognised as normal musical practice.
Cool. So it sounds like there's a lot of similarities, probably more similarities than dissimilarities, in the fact that you guys still have the same avenues that we have. And I'm assuming most of it is probably still following kind of the top-down director in front of an ensemble on the podium and everything, which is something we can talk about certainly through a Freudian view. But you said something about like rock ensembles and stuff. And being a professor with working with popular music yourself, would you say popular music is popular in schools? Music education, I should say, is popular in the schools over there?
Yeah, so I think the popular music education thing's interesting. That was a big eye-opener. So with no disrespect intended whatsoever, I'll often talk to very dear, valued friends and colleagues in the United States who are still dealing with the notion of popular music education as part of the academy as a novelty, as a revolution, as something quite radical. Whereas in the United Kingdom, and certainly in Scotland, we've been seeing this kind of thing maybe since the late 1970s or early 80s. So in fact, longer than I've been on this planet, if you like, So to me, I've just grown up into a system in which actually, if you're going to play rock music on your electric guitar as part of your educational journey through the music curriculum, great. I'm a saxophone player myself, and I was always able to play rock music or jazz or the things that I was interested in. Now, I wouldn't want to say that it's necessarily commonplace, and actually throughout my childhood there were some really important steps taken. So a man who was my teacher then, and he's now a friend and colleague these days, Neil Somerville is called, he started up what's called Edinburgh School's Rock Ensemble. And actually that was quite radical at the time, but we're talking 25 years ago when I was at high school, so actually even in that last quarter century that's just become commonplace. And the idea actually, because of innovators like that, the idea that this is something that kids and young people can get engaged with, and that it is valuable and that it is worthy of study, has just fed all the way through. So we've got university courses up and down the country that are very specifically popular music performance or popular music production, or music degrees that have heavy popular music strands within them. So it very much is kind of entrenched into the system. Whether that's done in the most humanising, liberatory way is another question, and we're going to get on to some of these debates. But yeah, certainly it exists. I've got massive problems with how it exists, but it exists.
Okay. Well, that's kind of cool. Let's brush on that a little bit, because when I think about music education in the United States, we don't have that. Like you said, we're still like bracing with that conflict of the Western classical music, the highbrow, like this is the elite kind of music versus the novelty of pop music and the validity of it, really. And I think one thing that music education in the United States has done well is kind of providing that access to everybody for music education in this highbrow sense, in the sense of removing that barrier between this was elite music and now everybody has access to it. So now it's just music. But unfortunately, it definitely comes with its caveats. You know, the model is the director in front of the classroom, do as I say. This is correct music. This is the correct way to phrase that. Don't play it like that. Don't play that style. Don't come up with your own ideas. Play exactly what's on the page, which is a very oppressive way of kind of delivering education, and doesn't allow for any kind of student-teacher relationship, whereas it's much more of an authoritative oppressor to the oppressed. And that being said, there's also something about times have changed, and now we have this popular music where the popular music really is the music of the students these days, yet we're not doing much to uplift that. What would you say Frary would say about kind of our scopes of music education as they exist right now, kind of broadly?
That's interesting. I mean, it's such a complex situation, right? It's not as simple as, and you know this, we both know this, and I'm sure anyone that might be listening to this knows this. It's not as simple as this exists and it's correct, you're only allowed to play this. This exists and it's incorrect, you're not allowed to play this, please don't touch it, and therefore you're kind of separated. These things are always existing in our lives and in the kind of multiple domains in which we engage with learning about music and learning about culture. But something funny happens when we step into the school and we step into formal education, in which that hierarchy is just built immediately for us. It's built in a way that means, often because of the pressures associated with education, and I want to come back to that in a second, we feel an imperative to work in a way that helps us to move towards that which has been set out for us.
Mm-hmm.
So what you say, what would Frary say about this? And I suppose I'm reluctant. I'm reluctant to say what Frary might say. I can say what I might think about it through my Frarian
we don't want to
position.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And certainly even that question kind of turns into a Frary thing of cultural invasion, and now we're putting our words to him. So maybe not. So
that wasn't to discredit the question. It was just to I suppose to distance myself and say I've spent a number of years really immersing myself in I think critical pedagogy and certainly in the work of Frary. So all I can answer is my take on it, informed by his writings and the writings of others.
Okay, let me maybe rephrase my question. So instead of what he would say. In him in particular, somebody who largely submits to Frary's views and is familiar with them, what is the overall consensus as far as how you would feel emotionally? Like, do you feel offended by the state of music education? Do you feel like it is doing its job, or is there some kind of middle ground? I know there's certainly areas where we can improve, but overall, in a general statement, how are we doing? Are we humanizing or oppressive?
I think largely oppressive, to be honest, and I don't think that matters if we're teaching popular music or if we're teaching classical music. I think it's the paradigms that this is all built on is oppressive and colonising and culturally invasive regardless. Now, I want to go back and explain why I've said that. I think when we're reading Frary and we're applying the writings of Frary to the world, we need to remember that this is absolutely based on a particular political and economic view of the world, right? Mm-hmm. We can't take Frary out of its Marxist roots. We can't take the writings and thinking of Frary outside of the anti-capitalist project that it's a part of. And we need to, I think, be really mindful of the fact that we're living in this kind of what some people call late stage capitalism, but we're certainly living in kind of deep neoliberal capitalism, in which everything about the world seems to be reduced to the logic of the market. Everything about the world seems to be dominated by the notion of things that are saleable, things that are commodifiable, things that are measurable. And we've got this positivistic, market-driven business ontology, to use a phrase from Mark Fisher, that underpins everything that we're doing. Mm-hmm. And I think so much of music education has become aligned with or shaped by this business ontology, and particularly in popular music education, I'll come back to why in a minute, that I think everything that we're doing is about passing on things to people so that they can then be appraised within this market logic. Right? So then if we think about popular music, the very subject is so closely wedded to the market, it's so closely wedded to the creative industries, it's so informed by these notions of the culture industry, that so often, particularly in higher education, what we're saying is, okay, you're studying this because you want a job in this field, you need to learn to do these things, you need to be able to demonstrate that you can do X, Y, and Z, which are outlined by market imperatives. So actually, I think when we're working in that way particularly, yeah, I think it's absolutely domesticating. I think what we're doing is we're saying the world is as it is, you have no agency, you have no power, this is how the world works, this is who you have to be, this is how you have to behave, this is how you need to enact music or musicking or musical behaviour. And because that's so shaped by that logic, it's so shaped by that business ontology that underpins everything, I think we're inevitably domesticating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I completely agree. I want to dive in maybe a little bit closer. Let's take a look at the role of the teacher kind of in this aspect. And there's a really interesting perspective from a book written by Victor Wooten. And this book was called The Music Lesson. Great book, good read for any musician, music teacher out there. And in that, he started talking about teaching, how he thinks teaching is done effectively, what worked for him, and what he tries to do for his students. And he talked about this idea of teaching itself as a concept actually being impossible. And he said, until the day exists that we have technology where we can take a USB drive and plug it into somebody's brain and then just download that information into them, we'll never actually be able to really teach somebody. We'll always be kind of guiding through. And he talked about the role of a teacher kind of being a guide. And I thought about that so much as being, he kind of stumbled into a Freirean view a little bit of the teacher, where Freire talks about this student-teacher, teacher-student kind of co-authorship of their education to uplift the students. I'm not sure where my question lies in this, but like, what are your thoughts on kind of that view of we can't really teach? Do you think Freire would kind of agree with that? It's kind of this guiding and mentorship.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, if what we're suggesting is teaching is the depositing of knowledge, the depositing of facts. He talks about it in the second chapter of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. That whole chapter is about banking education. He's talking about people being passive receptacles into which we pour knowledge, and then if we are going to assess them, we test how well they can regurgitate that which has been given to them from a superior intellect, etc. And yes, I mean, if that's how we're viewing teaching, I would maybe disagree, and I would say we absolutely can do that, and we do that, and actually that's the normative approach to most education and certainly in the global north, is this idea of we will give you things that you can regurgitate to us in order for us to be able to certify your learning so you can enter the labour market. Yeah. Generally speaking. So yeah, we absolutely can. And we do. I'm using we in the widest sense possible because actually I'd love to distance myself from that. I suppose it's the question of, is that what we should be doing? Is that part of a liberatory project, or is that a domesticating project? Well, absolutely it's a domesticating project, again, to come back to that phrase. We can do that. We do that. And actually, and I hate to say it, and I know there'll be a lot of friends and colleagues in music education that'll hate me for saying it, But actually, I think so much of what we do is exactly that. Now, it sounds nefarious when we say it like that, doesn't it? It's, I will stand at the front of the classroom and pour knowledge into your empty vessel of a skull until you're able to regurgitate to me the things that I have been able to tell you. But actually, if we kind of strip away that theatre and strip away the way that I'm deliberately hamming it up for effect, actually, if so much of what we're doing is kind of depositing ideas, depositing concepts, depositing fingering patterns, depositing knowledge about which composers are valid, which aren't, which approaches to music are important, which aren't, which types of musical ensemble are important, which are of a lower order. Actually, we're doing all these kind of things. We are, I think we're engaging in acts of oppression that impose our culture and our values on those with whom we work. Now, that's not necessarily nefarious. Sitting with your children and teaching them songs that you want to sing together as a family. Being in a school classroom in which you're getting people to engage in playing music together. These are all great things, but if we think, okay, why are we doing that? Why is it this? What is my position in the room, and how am I indoctrinating them into what it means to be musical and what it means to music together? Then actually we are starting to become colonisers. We are starting to engage in cultural invasion.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, that sounds really nefarious. That sounds as if we're kind of Bond villains that are trying to program their minds. Of course, that's not what we're saying. But what we're saying is, if we are the centre, if we are the arbiters, if we are the catalyst for everything that happens, without engaging with their cultural needs, their cultural identities, their desires, their ambitions, then yeah, that's when we start to stray into, I think, oppressive conditions. Now, we're doing that because we've been oppressed by the system. I don't want that kind of false dichotomy of oppressor and oppressed equals student and teacher, because, you know, teachers are equally oppressed in this system, and particularly if you do see that kind of economic condition as being the base for that oppression in the first place. We're just as conditioned by that system, however, we're perpetuating it. So we're not giving people the opportunity necessarily to think about that situation, and that's where the need for critical consciousness in music education comes into play, I think. It's great to teach people how to do things. It's great to help people learn how to do things, but if all we're doing is repurposing and reproducing that which we've already deemed as valuable, what are we doing for their subjectivities?
Yeah. I totally agree with you that we kind of perpetuate this whole system, largely informed by our experiences in what we've experienced, replicating that ourselves. I think there's also a lot to be said about the system forcing us to as well. And I'd love to circle back on that. We'll dive into a couple of other things and then tie this together. So maybe let's talk about grading and the way we do that. And I think music education kind of has an advantage over other forms of education in this sense. We can be a little bit more free and subjective, which allows us to introduce more humanizing practices. And for example, I think there's the idea of approaching grading from a standards-based grading. Did student A meet requirement X by the 8th grade level or whatever? Whereas I think a lot of times in music education, we try and do kind of more of a growth-based assessment. We start it here, and throughout the year, the student got to here. Learning was achieved. We didn't say how much learning was achieved, but we saw learning was achieved. There was growth in that student, and therefore there was success. Now, I certainly think we still end up putting objective measurements and standards on this because we are forced to by our jobs. But largely, I think we do a fairly good job of that in music education grading. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm really delighted to hear you say that. I think we might be dealing with our relative cultural differences here again.
Okay.
Actually. That's great to hear you say that. I don't think that happens nearly enough in most of the formal music education situations that people engage with over here. So I think it can, and I think when people take the opportunity to allow it to happen, it can be wonderful, but I think it doesn't often. So I'm thinking of, things like graded exam syllabus, something like the Associated Board, the ABRSM, for instance. Yeah, I don't know how well that translates, but the Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music. So exam boards that are set up in order to say students have achieved grade 1 on an instrument, grade 2 on an instrument, grade 3 all the way up to grade 8, and then further qualifications on an instrument. These are very much stand in front of an external expert arbiter. I'm doing this because I'm a saxophone player. It's my default hand position. Stand in front of an external an examiner who is an external arbiter. Perform the things that you've learned, and they'll judge you and tell you how well you've done it. You get a mark out of 150 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
You're sent on your way. Okay, so in schools, how does that happen? Again, can you play this piece? Yes, great. Proceed? No, sorry, you've not been able to pass that. Music theory exams, is this correct? Is this incorrect? So I don't think necessarily we're given the opportunity. That said, though, in university setting, honestly, I have not, quote unquote, graded a piece of work for nearly 10 years.
Okay.
And that's including composition classes, that's including kind of more scholarly academic work, because actually the way that I approach this, again, very much influenced by a critical pedagogy belief system, if you like, is that I'm there to facilitate their development. Mm-hmm. Sure, there are things, being older, being around the block a few more times than my students, that I can point them to, that I've experienced that they might not have yet. I've got knowledge that they maybe haven't acquired yet. But so do they, in reverse, have knowledge that I've never encountered, because they're younger, because they've not seen the things I've seen, because they've engaged in different cultural settings. So my belief is very much based on what we might call the kind of ungrading movement that a lot of people are talking about. So maybe drawing on scholars like Susan Bloom or Jessie Stommel, for instance. Mm-hmm. And it's very much about saying, okay, how can I be the facilitator of assessment practices that allow the students, the learners, to develop their practice in the way they want to towards their own authentic humanisation, right? So it's about them deciding what the exam question is, the essay question. It's about them deciding what the grading criteria are. It's about them deciding, therefore, then using that to go on and assess and examine their own work in reflective dialogue with me, so that we can work together to talk about how they might be able to develop, how they might be able to push things forward. So it definitely can happen. And I don't want to be conceited and say, well, if I can do it, everyone else can do it. I think I am very aware of my privilege in that I'm a professor in a university, and therefore I've got maybe a bit more freedom than other people might have to enact these kind of things. But it is absolutely doable, providing we can figure out ways to bring students and learners into the conversation. And I think that's what's often missed. Right, even if we go for it's a growth-based approach, or it's a distance-travelled approach to assessment, I think the fact that we're still set up as the hegemons, we're still set up as the people in the position of power who are able to make the decision about progress. That to me is where the trouble lies. When the hierarchy is set up like that, we can't. To go back to Freire, we can't dismantle the student-teacher contradiction, because inevitably the system casts us as arbiters. It casts us as higher up, it casts us as more important, more knowledgeable, and we revert back to pedagogies that align more with oppressive tendencies, that align more with cultural invasion, and not enabling people to get involved in the self-critique of their own development. Feels utterly... I don't know, I was trying to think of a word that wouldn't bleep when I said it, that you wouldn't need to have a bleeper for. It feels pointless, to say the least, but it feels cruel.
Yeah,
to be
dehumanizing, maybe, as Freire would say.
Dehumanizing, as Freire would say, but beyond that, I think cruel, restrictive.
Yeah. I want to respond to two things. First, going back to what I initially said about, I feel like we do a pretty good job in music education. Now, I want to give the caveat to that is we're not there. Just like you said, you stand up there and you stand and you do your levels and everything and pass things off. We have state standardized assessments where we go and we sit on a stage in front of a panel of judges, And they said, based off of your school size and where you're at, you have to play this difficulty level, and we're going to give you a grade based off of that, which is right back to the not what Frary wants, right? But when we're in the education classroom, I think a lot of our grading tends to be very participation based. Did they show up and just kind of come to class and willing to learn? At least myself, I don't want to generalize too much, try to really avoid a lot of those benchmark and like written test and things like that and playing test in the music education classroom. In higher education, it's interesting. You talked about music theory, and I think music theory and music history are kind of still the most like academic following models of I'm going to give you the test, you got 9 out of 10 correct, and looking at it that way. But outside of that, I think higher education is a bit more free in allowing you to do things like the ungrading method. And it's so interesting because I hadn't even heard of that stuff until I entered the realm of higher education and seeing all this. And so maybe to go back to our point we were talking about earlier about perpetuating this oppressive education, and we talked about it replicates itself based off of our own experiences, but how do we break out of this when the system itself is forcing us into this? Because in secondary education and outside of higher education, we are largely told as teachers, you're going to be assessed by, did your students meet this? If they didn't meet that standard, you're going to lose your job. You're a bad teacher. You have to hit these benchmarks. You have to fit into that receptacle-based model, or else you're not going to fit into the model of education. So how can we go about trying to start change to allow for some more humanity, you could say, in education, allowing students to self-assess and be self-critical within that kind of realm? And then maybe even can we start the change here, or does it have to start above us before we're able to?
Okay.
Sorry, it's a lot.
No, it's great. It is great. I really like what you're saying. I really like the way you're framing it, and you're making me think. I think the first thing is, and I know this is a reiteration, and it's a bit of a hobby horse of mine, but all of this is shaped by that kind of capitalist normativity that underpins everything. Okay,
yeah.
I can't do it this way because I'll lose my job. Well, losing your job is a fear of not being able to put food on the table and a roof over your head, amongst other things. But that's, it's about being able to live. It's about being able to participate in society in that sort of way. That underpins the whole thing. But the way that we sometimes talk, and even the formation of the question betrays something that we all do, which I think is the system says this. And I think so often we forget about the fact that we are the system, and the world exists because we make it.
That's true.
We make the world by living in it. We make the road by walking it. The fact that nothing will change if nothing changes is so fundamental to this, right? And I know that's a cliche, and you could stick it on a fridge magnet if you like, but it's true. Nothing will change if nothing changes. So unless we start developing counter-hegemonic strategies to actually make real change that's going to help to develop people's ideas about what we should be doing, we're going to just be mired in this kind of cycle of fatalism, I think. Mm-hmm. So if we accept the premise that there's not an external system that does things into which we fit, and rather that we are the system, okay, how can we start thinking about counter-hegemonic processes that might lead to kind of eventual revolution and change in the way that we set ourselves up? Well, I think that's about to go back to what Freddie said, it's about developing critical consciousness. It's about helping people to read the world and helping people see the situation that they're in and asking them how they feel about it. It's about being able to work with our learners, their parents, employers, all the people who might be stakeholders in someone's educational journey to say, okay, well, what do we actually mean? What are we doing to people by forcing them through this system? What are we doing to the people who don't fit the norms of this system? How are we diminishing people's humanity by making them fit our normative models of success? Right? So I think as soon as we start to do that, and this sounds naive and it sounds utopian, but I think as soon as we start to do that, actually we start pushing at doors that are more likely to open than we think they are. You know, if we can use a theoretical, philosophical basis for explaining why we're doing something in a slightly different way, in my experience, actually people are quite receptive to that idea. I think the kind of hegemonic weight of tradition can, in some places, with the right key, you can start to unlock that door slightly. And sometimes that's about just kind of heart on the sleeve. This is what I believe, and this is why I'm doing it. But again, that's a privilege that not everybody has. Again, I can kind of stand here as a straight white guy who's able to kind of push at a lot of those doors quite easily because I don't have to worry about race or culture or language or any of the other things that a lot of our colleagues do have to worry about. So I just want to make that really clear. I'm aware of the privileges that allow me to speak in a somewhat utopian manner.
Absolutely.
But it's on all of us to work together as a community of practice. It's on all of us to work together as a group of educators and scholars and thinkers to think, okay, how counter-hegemonic processes can we engage in? How can we sell these ideas? How can we make students understand the importance of what we're trying to do for them? How can we make students understand the importance of themselves as individuals, not just as kind of widgets on a conveyor belt that are going into a system? And I think once we start to do that, we're able to change minds a bit. But then more cynically, at the same time, given that we do have this kind of capitalist agenda that sits behind everything that we're doing, and education is a teleological process that leads towards employment eventually, as is so often the case in music education, I think we can do a lot of the kind of mind tricks almost, because if what they want is employable graduates who can go out and do the things that we've taught them to do, well, great. What better than teaching students to be autonomous, sustainable learners from the outset? Actually, that's what employers want. That's what graduate positions want. That's what people in the industry want. And we can actually do that by saying, okay, these are the things that will help you to understand the world. These are the things that will help you to get on in the world. And actually teaching them to do specific manual tasks is probably out with our responsibility, to be honest, because there are other more effective, more cost-effective, quicker ways to learn things that we don't need any longer to be standing shoveling into people's minds.
Yeah. I think one of the difficulties I face when trying to conceptualize kind of critical pedagogy and applying this in, like you said, this lens of capitalism that we ultimately have to meet somehow, because at the end of the day, we have to have some kind of evidence in order to back up our change. And you said that generally, if we're able to talk about it and philosophically kind of back up, a lot of people tend to be open and receptive. And I certainly see scenarios where that is the case. But at the end of the day, I still am just wary of so many people want that number. They want some kind of quantitative, this was my GPA, or I was first place or something. And all of that quantitative measurement, which is just very kind of positivist in a sense, it's just completely antithetical to Freire's views. But we have to conform to it at some point. And how do we do both? How do we fit Freire's idea of developing the consciousness and quantify it to meet the world standards? Or can we even?
I mean, you point to a beautiful contradiction. It's one that we'll have to unpick over generations. We need to sow the seeds of that formative culture now, right? And I think if we don't, and if we shy away from it and if we're so disheartened by that contradiction that you've just pointed out so beautifully, then it's never ever going to change. So we need to start sowing the seeds now. Right, so strategically then, strategically, how do we think about doing that? Well, if the computer still needs a number at the end of the session to say, little Johnny got a 67, little Sarah got a 75, whatever, and we still need to input that, then that's fine, right? Okay, that's not ideal. We'd like to be more enlightened. We'd like to be working in a qualitative paradigm where actually we're not mired with a positivistic epistemology that bounds everything to a kind of number value system. But okay, let's be pragmatic as you're suggesting and say, okay, we've got that now, and that's what we need to do. How we get to that number, that's on us. Right, so we can say we can, and this is what I find myself having to do a lot of the time in my day job, is saying, okay, the computer still needs a number. Yeah, before I go on in the UK we would call it Christmas holiday, but before I take the holidays in December, I need to input the grades of all those learners in my classes and say what they achieved in the module that they've just done. Fine. How do we get there? My students get themselves there in almost every case. So yeah, I'll still put a number in because that's what the system needs, and we talk all term about how that number's somewhat meaningless, and actually we're just using it as a quantitative indicator of their qualitative experience, but it's qualitative experience that we'll prioritise. So as I say, in every class that I run, my students will develop their own criteria, they'll develop their own question, they'll develop their own problem, they'll develop their own project, they'll develop their own portfolio, they'll then develop the marking criteria for that, which will be qualitative. They'll say how well they think they've done on each of these and what they could do to develop in conversation with me. And then that will be fed into the system that will spit out a number. We've worked so hard to get to the stage where no one's worried by that one number. At the same time, though, they don't abuse that. They don't all give themselves 100%. They don't all give themselves 95%. Actually, what we get is a distribution, if we're going to go back to the positivist way of thinking, that's very similar to the normal distribution, and we get means that are very similar to the way that used to be when it was graded. So actually, I'm not seeing any lack of reliability. I'm not seeing any lack of robustness. I'm not seeing any lack of integrity. What I'm seeing is a humanising process whereby the students have, in conversation with a slightly more knowledgeable, in some respects, more experienced educator in me, have worked together to develop their consciousness about their own development, their own position in the world, and how they might seek to develop that over the coming years. The computer still gets its number at the end of the term, but actually everything that's led up to that has decentered me as the arbiter, as the expert, as the hegemon in the classroom, and actually said, okay, how can we work together as individuals to understand our place, break the student-teacher contradiction as much as possible, so that we are collaboratively exploring how well you've done as learners, where you want to take things, all based on your own desires and your own intentions and ambitions from the very outset of the whole project.
That's really cool. So like through your work in ungrading, you've taken that idea of the co-authorship in learning between the student-teacher, teacher-student relationships and extended that to the grading process, where you guys are working that together and mutually deciding on that.
Yes, but it goes even further than that. I wouldn't even say it's necessarily mutually deciding. They
decide it themselves.
They decide, and whatever goes, whatever they say goes, and that sticks. And we get students that voluntarily fail themselves because they don't think they've achieved what they set out to achieve, and they'll have to reset that work during the summer, and that's fine. And I'm not saying the mark of rigour and the mark of robustness is that students choose to fail themselves, but what I'm saying is it's interesting that through a genuine critical self-reflection, students are able to suggest that without me saying I'm going to impose a grade, without me saying even if you pass yourself I'm going to fail you because I'll decide at the end, without me being involved in that process, other than as a sounding board for their reflective discussions about their own work, that they've chosen to suggest that they've not got out of things what they wanted to do. And I think what that suggests is that it's putting the ball back in their court. It's saying, this is about you. I am merely the facilitator of your educational journey. You're not here to learn what I have to give you. I'm here to help you develop what you want to know. I've seen some cool stuff along the way that you might not have, and I'll show you that, and we'll take you there, and we'll go and have a look. I often use the analogy of like being a co-pilot in their they're driving or flying the plane or whatever, and I'm just kind of sitting there with cool stuff to show them along the way that they can go and see if they want, or maybe not, or go and see it and leave it or take it. I also sometimes use the analogy of a lighthouse, and I'm just there to kind of shine light into dark corners that they might not have seen yet, because I've maybe seen what's over there, and they're going to go and have a look and see what they think. But I mean, I'm kind of evangelical about this almost. This is not my education that I'm trying to give to them. This is their education that I'm trying to be a supportive co-pilot, navigator. No, navigator is even too prescriptive. I'm a safety net for them and them engaging in what they want to do. And the reason I can be a safety net for them is because I've got methodological, I've got theoretical, I've got philosophical underpinnings that they might not have developed that I can use to help prop up what they want to do in their own learning.
Very cool. Yeah, I think it's really cool. And especially, I think what a critic would say of what we're talking about is that, there's just so much room to abuse that system. Of course, if they discover they can just give themselves A's, they're just going to do it. But yet you're not seeing that. You're still seeing people holding themselves accountable. And that's just really cool.
Yeah, and we do get those critics. You're absolutely right. They'll just abuse it and they'll give themselves an A. Right. So firstly, I would say what you've just said is, well, I don't see that because this is part of the discussion that we're having now is a discussion that I'll have in every class to varying degrees with the very students that I'm working with. So by the time they finish their 4-year undergraduate degree, they're very well versed in the reasons for this. And I link them to Freire, and I link them to Giroux, and I link them to Darder, and I link them to all the people that we would want them to be thinking about. Not to say these are the texts and these are the political ideologies that you have to engage with, because a lot of them aren't necessarily left-leaning. A lot of them aren't necessarily interested in being critical about the world. But to say, this is why I'm doing the things that we're doing, okay? I let them understand why I'm doing the things that I'm doing and saying that even if they choose to go in a completely different ideological direction, the basis for what we're doing is for these reasons that we've been discussing.
Yeah.
So they're encultured into this way of thinking. They understand that it's about them. They understand that actually this is probably the first time in their formal educational journey that they have been central in their own education rather than just cogs in the machine or numbers in a classroom. So we don't see that. We don't see them abusing it because they understand the value of self-reflection. The flippant answer to that hypothetical critic is also, so what? Right? Genuinely, so what? They give themselves an A? Cool. All they've got is a bit of paper that says they've got an A. Did they have the learning? Did they have the knowledge? Did they have the critical skills? Did they have the experience? No. So at the risk of being overly dismissive, if what people are interested in is the links between a degree certificate and prospective employment, we're working in a world in which there are no jobs, no employment, other than precarious, self-employed, gig economy hustle, generally speaking. Some folk will go and be teachers, maybe, and I know it's different in the United States because actually a lot of music degrees are education focused towards teaching jobs. But over here, that's not the case. The destination for people who leave music education at university level, it tends to be self-employed creative industries worker. Great, that's absolutely fine. So actually, if they've got a certificate that says they can do things in which they then can't necessarily do because in some way they've cheated themselves along the way, that's on them and they've done that to themselves. And I don't think there's necessarily a massive link between the certification and the ability anyway. So I'm less precious about what it means for someone to say they've been able to do something. Now, I can say that because I've got the safety net of knowing full well that people don't take advantage of it. But at the same time, even if someone was to, then all they've done is they've cheated themselves of a valuable learning experience and valuable opportunity to become a self-reflective, critical practitioner.
Yeah. And maybe that opportunity to have that skill set that you cheated yourself out of is maybe a situation in which music is kind of unique compared to a lot of the other areas. So we might be in a good spot to really be at the forefront of some of these changes.
And that's it, and that's so important. So I often speak with students about the fact that, okay, if we were in a different discipline, let's take structural engineering, for instance. I don't want students saying, yeah, I know the tensile strength of X material, and they don't, and then their bridge falls down, right? I don't want the people training to be heart surgeons to say, yeah, I know how this valve works and then someone bleeds out on the table, right? Okay, I'm being deliberately provocative here, of course, but we're not there. We're arts educators. We are not talking about objectivity. We're not talking about life or death. It's an important subject, and it's an important subject in human societies, but we're not talking about bridges falling down, right? So you might say, well, then it doesn't matter. You can just do whatever you want with them. And that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is, why should we be beholden to the epistemologies and the approaches to assessment of science disciplines or disciplines in which there are right or wrong answers, or we could have a kind of positivistic sense of objectivity. We're not.
Yeah.
So because we as an academy, because we kind of defer to and default towards that way of working, arts education often gets subsumed into that way of working without any challenge. What I'm saying is, whilst we are thinking about art, whilst we're thinking about creativity, whilst we're thinking about culture, let's not play by those rules, and therefore let's engage in a humanising education that means people can develop as self-sustaining, autonomous, reflective practitioners.
That's great. I think that ties into a little bit of what I was thinking about wrapping up with, was kind of an idea of a self-reflection and looking at ourselves as facilitators of change and implementing some of the things that we've talked about, and the dangers and pitfalls that we might fall into along that way. And Freire said a quote that has always stuck with me, and it's, "Scholars boasting of their radical proposals to the degree that they are more Maoist than Marxism in their political orientation is an appropriated economical and political currency in the ivory tower." And to me, what that quote is talking about is kind of this danger of taking things too far and then just getting a little bit too metaphysical with things, to the point where we're using it as an economic currency, a political currency for our own gain, and not keeping it student-centered. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean that's a really interesting one to bring up. I was smiling as you read the quote aloud. Yes, absolutely. I have recognised situations in which I've seen colleagues or people that I know of but don't necessarily work with who use these ideas as, let's say, performative gestures of progressiveness. Right, or kind of tokenistic nods towards traditions that at certain points are trendy, are fashionable, are edgy, are countercultural, I suppose you could say in some ways. And actually, at times of crisis, as I would suggest we maybe are in just now, mindful of your recent general election and the inconsequential outcome of our supposed Labour government coming into power, I think a lot of people do actually suggest, well, I've read Freire, or I've read Giroux, or I've read Irish Shaw, or Michael Apple, and kind of all these people, as if to say, yes, I've read this stuff, I've got my feet in this tradition. It doesn't matter what I go on to do. It doesn't matter how I conduct myself. It doesn't matter how I uphold the oppressions of the academy, because I've read these scholars, you know? Mm-hmm. And I think you're absolutely right. If we don't firstly locate it within the socio-economic context in which these ideas are born from, secondly, recognise that it's a way for us to relinquish power, it's a way for us to decenter ourselves, it's a way for us to envisage a pedagogy that is truly humanising, which means putting those who we're working with at the forefront and engaging with their needs, their desires, their cultural experience, their lived experience. It is performative tokenism that doesn't help anybody and actually just serves to further remove and strip the relevance of these beautiful ideas from our current existence. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll often
well said.
Thank you. I'll often get reviews from journal articles, and it'll be something like, again, this is a reference from 1971, right? So the English translation of Pedagogy of the Press, for instance. This is a reference to 1971. Haven't you read anything more recent? And it's kind of it's almost like some of these ideas have been rolled up into a little kind of hippie countercultural ball and shoved to one side. But I think in moments of real class crisis, in moments of economic despair, in moments of widening inequality, diminishing public services, collapsing of the very identity or notion of the state, more than anything, we need to be sowing these seeds within our educational context. And we could say, well, we're just musicians, we just teach them to play things. We don't. We're doing so much more there because we're at the forefront of their engagement with culture. If what we're doing is telling these people that only our cultures are valuable, only our musics are the ones that we should engage with, only our way of envisaging what it means to be successful or important, we are doing the exact opposite of what we need to do, whether we can nod to these so-called radical texts or not. So if we see these as radical texts that sit trendily on our bookshelves and signal a progressive ambience in our office, this is utter nonsense, and it's kind of mindless tokenism that is just going to make the situation worse. These are not texts of dogma, these are texts of the lived experience of people and how we can help to make the world a better place through our engagement with them.
I just want to snap for that because that was really, really well said. Really good.
Sorry, I go off on a roll sometimes.
No, it was wonderful. Let me go back to relating to kind of current events and where we at today. Pedagogy of the Oppressed was written in the 1960s. Freire was in Brazil during this military coup, military dictatorship going on. He grew up he was a teenager during the Great Depression. He saw a lot of hardship and a lot of extremes, to the point we're not quite at today in the US, but we are certainly seeing some very extreme directions happening with our recent election and everything, and the polarization of the two political fields. Do you think that Freire would point out that our kind of authoritative and oppressive structure to education and society is possibly a contributing factor to what has led back to this oppressive and separated state and culture and society that we've arrived to?
Absolutely, without a shadow of doubt. Yes, I think you're absolutely right to point out the fact that these are different cultural contexts, these are different linguistic contexts, these are different kind of completely different countries with different governments and different ways of dealing with problems as you've discussed. But I think again, that's in some ways and I really don't mean to trivialise the military action and the dictatorship. I'm not suggesting that it's not important for a minute, but I think actually the fact that it might look slightly different is not the issue. The fact that it's built on the same economic injustices, the fact that it's built on the same oppressive and dehumanising conditions based on the way in which we engage with the capitalist mode of production. That's the issue here. Now, Freire was dealing with military coups, and you're talking about an America in which that's not necessarily happening, although January the 6th, 4 years ago, was maybe not a million miles away. I appreciate that I'm speaking as an outsider here and maybe should mind my place. But that's not the issue. We're still dealing with the same injustices. We're still dealing with the same inequalities. The fact is, though, in a contemporary consumerist society, some of the poorest in society have expensive trainers, or they've got a car on hire purchase. That's fine. Just because they're not shoeless and walking around the street doesn't mean that they're not dealing with the same injustices. We've just got, even worse in some ways, a consumerist society that pulls them into debt, that pulls them into engaging with capitalism in a completely different way. So just because we're seeing the kind of the products of capitalism, and just because we're seeing the what some people might see as the pros of a system that allows people to have consumer goods, for instance, doesn't change the fact that the same inequalities, the same exploitations are being reproduced through society, but certainly through education. And I think in some ways, even more so because of the fact that things have become so closely and inextricably linked to paradigms of employment. You know, you shell out enormous amounts of money in the United States for university education. I'm in Scotland, in which that's paid for by the government. I didn't pay for any education until I went to do my PhD, and even then it was only something like £2,000 a year for 3 years because of the fact that I had part of a bursary. I've got colleagues that studied in the United States that have got literally hundreds of thousands of pounds, and I'm probably speaking to a man who's nodding out of recognition here. You know, the fact that people will pay that amount of money to become certified in order to do something has to link it even more closely to the notion of it being an investment for the future, for employment, right? I think even more so these things have become so aligned, and when they become so aligned, it is linked to the capitalist normativities that underpin the workforce that people want to move into. Education's become an arm of that, and it's become something that people pay dearly for and are less likely to kind of rock the boat. So yeah, I would say that the kind of oppressions that Freddie talks about are exacerbated in the state of capitalism that we're in at the moment, far beyond what was described in the text necessarily, but also that education has been so linked to the domestication of people towards that lived reality that now, even more than any other time in history, I think we're in a position where we need to be engaging with these ideas. And as artists that have the freedom but also have links to culture and that have links to the ability to communicate with people on a level that goes beyond merely just engaging with text, that evokes emotion, that evokes lived experience, that evokes humanity, we've got the opportunity to do things that can really start to make differences. And that difference needs to start with the cultivation of a critical consciousness to understand the world around us, to understand our place within it, and how we might take steps to change it should we wish to.
And perhaps as we're stuck in this cyclical reproduction of these same oppressive hierarchies and hegemonies, like perhaps we're doomed to self-replicate until we make these changes. And only by making these changes, we'll be able to break ourselves out of this.
Absolutely. And these will be small, iterative steps towards changes. I don't believe in the fact that there'll be a revolutionary instant that will change it all tomorrow just because we've talked on a podcast or just because someone else has picked up Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Of course not. But the fact that we're having these discussions, we're thinking about critical consciousness as steps towards developing counter-hegemonic alternatives to the status quo, at least suggests that there is something that's pushing away in the background that might help us to break these cycles of reproduction.
Great. Well, we're about out of time here, so thank you so much for coming on. This has been a wonderful conversation. I've had a great time.
Sure. Yeah, likewise.
All right. Well, thank you again.
Nice one. All right. Really nice to see you.